In the annals of American blues history, few figures embody the fusion of verifiable talent and posthumous mythology as profoundly as Robert Johnson, whose brief life and 29 recorded songs from 1936 to 1937 have exerted an outsized influence on genres from rock to folk. Born in 1911 in rural Mississippi amid the hardships of the Jim Crow South, Johnson emerged as a Delta blues innovator, blending intricate guitar techniques like bottleneck slide and rhythmic fingerpicking with raw, introspective lyrics that explored themes of isolation, wanderlust, and existential dread, as heard in classics such as Crossroads Blues and Hellhound on My Trail. His work directly shaped the trajectories of artists like Muddy Waters, Elmore James, and later rock icons including Eric Clapton and the Rolling Stones, who covered his tracks and cited him as a cornerstone of modern music's evolution. Yet Johnson's legacy is dominated by a persistent legend rooted in African American folklore and amplified by 1960s blues revivalists. The notion that he achieved his mastery through a supernatural pact at a Delta crossroads, exchanging his soul for guitar virtuosity. This narrative draws from anecdotal accounts by contemporaries like Son House, who recalled Johnson as an initially inept player in the early 1930s, only to witness his dramatic improvement after a period of absence, likely spent honing skills under mentors like Ike Zimmerman. Songs referencing devils and crossroads were reinterpreted literally, while his suspicious death at age 27 in 1938, possibly from poisoned whiskey, amid romantic entanglements, fueled tales of demonic pursuit. And when he died at the shockingly young age of 27, his body found by the side of a dusty road, the legend was sealed. This is the story of the man at the crossroads, the ghost who became the grandfather of rock and roll. To understand Robert Johnson, you have to feel the place that created him, the Mississippi Delta in the 1920s and 30s. This was not just a location, it was a state of being. Imagine a vast, flat expanse of land, shimmering with heat, dominated by cotton fields that stretched to the horizon. This was the heart of the Jim Crow South, a world of systemic racial oppression and crushing poverty for the African American sharecroppers who worked the land. Life was a relentless cycle of hard labor from sunup to sundown for pitifully little reward. But in this world of hardship, there was an escape. There was the music. On weekends, the stifling air of the plantations would give way to the vibrant, chaotic energy of the juke joints. These were makeshift shacks, little more than wooden rooms packed with people where workers could blow off steam, dance, drink, and listen to the raw, cathartic sound of the blues. The blues wasn't just entertainment, it was a news service for the soul, a way of singing about the pain, the injustice, and the fleeting joys of a brutal life. It was the sound of humanity refusing to be crushed. This is the world that Robert Johnson was born into around May 8th, 1911, and from his very first moments, his life was marked by instability. He was born Robert Dodds, the 11th child of his mother Julia, but his father wasn't Julia's husband, Charles Dodds, a prosperous landowner who had been forced to flee town after a dispute with a white mob. Robert's biological father was a local farmhand named Noah Johnson. This tangled parentage meant that Robert's childhood was a nomadic one. He was shuttled between his mother in the Delta and his mother's husband in Memphis, a boy with no firm roots and an ever-changing last name. For a time, he went by Robert Spencer, the new name his mother's husband had adopted. Locals on the plantations where his mother worked simply called him Little Robert Dusty, after his stepfather. It wasn't until he was a teenager that he learned the truth about his real father and officially took the name Robert Johnson. This constant shifting of names, of homes, of identity seems to have instilled in him a deep restlessness that would define his entire life. He was a quiet, pensive boy who found his only real solace in music. He fell in love with the sound of the blues, hanging around older, established musicians like Son House and Charlie Patton, trying to learn what they knew. He was desperate to make the guitar speak the language of his own unsettled heart. Robert Johnson's life was steeped in a sorrow that went far beyond the general hardship of the Delta. Before he ever sang a note of the blues professionally, he lived a tragedy that would have broken most men. In 1929, at the young age of 18, he married his sweetheart, a 16-year-old girl named Virginia Travis. They were just children, trying to build a small pocket of happiness for themselves. But that happiness was brutally short-lived. A year later, Virginia died in childbirth. Their baby died with her. The loss was catastrophic. It plunged Johnson into a profound depression. He was convinced that he was cursed, that he was destined for a life of loneliness and grief. He briefly tried marriage again with an older woman, Coletta Craft, but that relationship also ended in tragedy when she passed away within a year. After these devastating losses, it's said that Johnson gave up on the idea of a normal life forever. The dream of a home, of family and stability was gone. All he had left was the road and his guitar. It was in this period of intense grief that he dedicated himself entirely to music. It was his only escape. But there was a problem. He wasn't very good. The legendary bluesman Son House later recalled how the young Robert would hang around the juke joints, pestering the older musicians to let him play. When they would finally relent and give him a guitar during their breaks, the results were disastrous. House described his playing as a terrible racket, a noise that would drive people out of the room. Audiences would shout at him to stop. He had the passion, but none of the skill. And then he vanished. For about 6 months, maybe a little longer, nobody saw Robert Johnson. He just disappeared from his usual haunts in the Mississippi Delta. When he returned, something had changed. The clumsy, amateurish boy was gone. In his place was a musical virtuoso. He walked into a juke joint, picked up a guitar, and what came out was a sound that nobody had ever heard before. His fingers danced across the fretboard with an impossible dexterity. He played complex rhythms and haunting melodies all at once, making one guitar sound like two. And his voice, once unremarkable, was now a high, keening wail that could express a universe of pain. The transformation was so sudden, so total, that people couldn't explain it. Son House, who had once laughed him off the stage, was left speechless. He later said he was so good when he finished all our mouths were standing open. How had this happened? How could someone go from being a laughingstock to a master in just a few months? The locals, steeped in the folklore and superstitions of the Deep South, came up with their own explanation, the only one that seemed to make sense. He must have made a deal. He must have taken his guitar down to the Crossroads at midnight and sold his immortal soul to the devil. The legend of the Crossroads is the cornerstone of the Robert Johnson myth. According to the folklore of the Delta, a musician seeking extraordinary talent could go to a deserted rural crossroads at midnight. There, a large black man, the devil himself, would appear, take the musician's guitar, tune it, play a song, and hand it back. In exchange for the musician's soul, he would grant them mastery of the instrument. This story became permanently attached to Robert Johnson. It explained his sudden genius, and it seemed to be confirmed by the dark, tormented themes of his music. Songs like Crossroad Blues, Me and the Devil Blues, and Hellhound on My Trail sounded like first-hand accounts from a man who had made that very pact and was now living with the terrifying consequences. Johnson himself never denied the rumors. In fact, he seemed to enjoy cultivating the mystique. It made him an object of awe and fear, setting him apart from other musicians. It was the ultimate showman's gimmick. But was there a more earthly explanation for his transformation? Almost certainly. During his 6-month absence, it's now believed that Johnson returned to the area around his birthplace in Hazelhurst, Mississippi. There, he sought out a much older, obscure blues musician named Ike Zimmerman. Zimmerman was a local legend in his own right, a brilliant guitarist who was himself rumored to have supernatural skills. A persistent story says that Zimmerman would often practice at night, sitting on a tombstone in a local graveyard. It was likely here, in the quiet of a rural cemetery, that Robert Johnson truly learned to play. Zimmerman became his mentor, patiently teaching him the complex techniques and fingerings that would become his signature sound. When Johnson returned to the Delta, he wasn't possessed by the devil. He was armed with the knowledge passed down from a hidden master. The deal wasn't with Satan, but with a man named Ike Zimmerman. And the price wasn't his soul, but months of intense, dedicated practice. Still, the man who emerged from this period of study was a deeply complex and haunted figure. Fellow musicians who traveled with him, like Johnny Shines, described a man of contradictions. On stage, he was a mesmerizing, dramatic performer who could hold an audience in the palm of his hand. Off stage, he was often quiet, moody, and withdrawn, as if wrestling with some private pain. He was a notorious womanizer, with a network of girlfriends in towns all across the South, a habit that would ultimately prove fatal. He was also an unreliable traveling companion, prone to disappearing for days at a time without a word. He was a restless spirit, seemingly incapable of staying in one place for too long, always looking over his shoulder, as if the hellhounds he sang about were truly on his trail. The entire recorded legacy of Robert Johnson, the foundation upon which so much of modern music is built, comes from just 5 days of recording. In 1936, a talent scout for the American Record Corporation named H.C. Spear, who had a knack for finding blues talent, recommended Johnson to a producer named Don Law. Law arranged for Johnson to travel to San Antonio, Texas, for his first recording session. What happened in that makeshift studio, set up in a room at the Gunter Hotel, is the stuff of legend. Johnson was intensely shy and nervous. He couldn't stand the idea of anyone watching him play. So he turned his back to the producers and engineers and faced the corner of the room, as if he were playing only to the walls. And then he began. Over 3 days in November 1936, he recorded 16 songs, including future classics like I Believe I'll Dust My Broom, Sweet Home Chicago, and the iconic Crossroads Blues. His style was unlike anything the producers had ever heard. It was complex, rhythmic, and deeply emotional. His song, Terraplane Blues, a clever car-themed double entendre, became a modest regional hit, selling around 5,000 copies. The following year, in June 1937, Don Law arranged for a second session, this time in Dallas, Texas. Here, Johnson recorded 13 more tracks, completing his life's work. These Dallas recordings included some of his most haunting and influential songs, like the mournful Love in Vain and the terrifying Hellhound on My Trail. This latter song, with its imagery of a man relentlessly pursued by a demonic force, is often considered Johnson's masterpiece. It's a chilling piece of music, a portrait of pure paranoia and despair that feels intensely personal. For decades, these 29 recordings were all the world had of Robert Johnson. But in recent years, a fascinating and controversial discovery was made by musicologists. They found that the original recordings, released on 78 RPM records, had been intentionally sped up by the producers, likely by as much as 20%. This was a common practice at the time, done to make the music sound brighter and more energetic to compete with other records on the jukebox. When the recordings are slowed down to what is now believed to be their original intended speed, a different Robert Johnson emerges. The frantic, high-pitched wail becomes a deeper, more mournful and nuanced voice. The frenetic guitar work becomes more deliberate and complex. The sped-up versions inadvertently added to his myth, making him sound more otherworldly and demonic. The corrected versions reveal a musician of even greater emotional depth and subtlety. The mystery of Robert Johnson extends even to his physical appearance. For more than 50 years, only 2 confirmed photographs of him were known to exist. One is a formal studio portrait used for promotion, showing a young man in a pinstripe suit, a guitar held awkwardly in his hands. The other is a more casual, self-taken photo booth picture, where he has a cigarette dangling from his lips. These 2 images were the only windows into the face of the ghost. Then, in 2013, a third photograph surfaced, presented by the Johnson family. It purported to show Johnson posing with his friend and fellow musician, Johnny Shines. It was initially authenticated by a forensic expert, but almost immediately, blues historians and experts raised serious doubts. They pointed to the fact that the clothing seemed more typical of the 1940s after Johnson's death. They noted that the buttons on his shirt were on the left side, typical of women's clothing, suggesting the image might be reversed. But if the photo was flipped, it would show Johnson playing the guitar left-handed, and it's well established that he was right-handed. The authenticity of this third photo remains a subject of intense debate, another layer of uncertainty in a life composed almost entirely of shadows. In a strange way, the mystery of Robert Johnson's life came to an abrupt and definite end on August 16, 1938, near Greenwood, Mississippi, in LaFleur County, a rural area emblematic of the Delta's cotton plantations and juke joint culture. At 27, he was performing at a house party or juke joint on the Three Forks plantation, a location known for its lively gatherings, where blues musicians entertained sharecroppers and laborers after long days in the fields. The Delta in the 1930s was a place of economic hardship, racial oppression, and vibrant musical expression, with juke joints serving as social hubs where alcohol flowed, dances lasted into the night, and rivalries, romantic or professional, could turn volatile. Accounts from contemporaries describe Johnson falling ill suddenly during or after a performance. He had been playing for several nights at the venue, attracting crowds with his guitar skills and charismatic stage presence. On the night in question, likely August 13th or 14th, Johnson began experiencing severe symptoms, intense abdominal pain, vomiting, and difficulty breathing. He was taken to a nearby house or shack on the plantation, where he lingered for 2 to 3 days, suffering from convulsions and delirium. Witnesses reported him howling in agony, a detail that later fed into supernatural interpretations of his demise. No doctor was called immediately, as medical care for black individuals in the segregated South was often inaccessible or delayed, and home remedies were common. The official death certificate, discovered in 1968 by researcher Gail Dean Wardlow, lists the cause as "no doctor," a bureaucratic notation indicating no physician attended or certified the death. This lack of medical intervention contributed to the ambiguity surrounding his passing. Johnson was buried in an unmarked grave, initially thought to be at Quito Missionary Baptist Church near Morgan City, Mississippi, but later research suggested alternative sites like Payne Chapel Missionary Baptist Church or Little Zion Church in Greenwood. The uncertainty of his burial location, 3 headstones now mark possible graves, symbolizes the broader enigmas of his life and death. The timing of Johnson's death At the cusp of potential greater recognition, his recordings were gaining notice among blues enthusiasts, added to its tragic weight. He died without widespread fame, his 29 songs preserved on shellac records that would later be rediscovered in the 1960s folk revival. The abruptness of his end, cutting off a promising trajectory, has invited endless speculation, transforming a routine rural death into a cornerstone of blues mythology. Medical explanations for Robert Johnson's death have evolved with historical research and forensic analysis, though the absence of an autopsy leaves them speculative. One prominent theory is congenital syphilis, a condition Johnson may have contracted at birth or through sexual activity. Syphilis, untreated in the 1930s, progresses through stages, with the tertiary phase causing cardiovascular and neurological damage. Symptoms like abdominal pain, vomiting, and delirium align with syphilitic aortitis or neurosyphilis, which can lead to aneurysms or brain inflammation. Medical historians examining his death certificate and contemporary accounts note that syphilis was rampant in the Delta, affecting up to 40% of the black population due to limited healthcare access. Another possibility is Marfan syndrome, a genetic disorder causing elongated limbs, heart defects, and aortic weaknesses. Johnson's described physical features, long fingers ideal for guitar playing, and sudden death fit this profile, as aortic dissection can cause rapid deterioration. Combined with syphilis, it could explain his symptoms, though no genetic testing exists to confirm. Pneumonia is also proposed, potentially triggered by exposure during performances or weakened immunity. The Delta's humid climate and Johnson's itinerant lifestyle, sleeping in drafty shacks or outdoors, made respiratory infections common. Witness David Honeyboy Edwards recalled Johnson catching a cold after a poisoned drink incident, leading to pneumonia as the fatal complication. Without antibiotics like penicillin, not widely available until the 1940s, pneumonia was deadly, especially for someone with underlying health issues. These natural causes contrast with mythic narratives, but are supported by historical medical contexts. The 1930s South had high mortality from infectious diseases, with black individuals facing disproportionate rates due to poverty and segregation. Johnson's lifestyle, travel, alcohol consumption, and multiple partners increased risks for syphilis or respiratory ailments. While speculative, these explanations ground his death in the era's harsh realities, rather than supernatural forces. Robert Johnson's death is steeped in myths that elevate it from a tragic loss to a legendary event, intertwining with his life's folklore. The most enduring is the Crossroads legend. Johnson allegedly sold his soul to the devil at a Mississippi intersection for guitar mastery. This tale, rooted in African American hoodoo traditions and Yoruba trickster gods like Eshu, was transposed to a Christian devil figure by later interpreters. Songs like Crossroad Blues 1936 fueled this, describing desperation at a crossroads, though lyrics suggest hitchhiking woes rather than demonic pacts. His death at 27 amplified the myth, seen as the devil collecting his due. Speculations include poisoning as satanic retribution or syphilis as infernal punishment. These stories originated from contemporaries like Son House and Willie Brown, who marveled at Johnson's rapid skill improvement after a disappearance, attributing it to supernatural aid. Posthumously, white collectors like John Hammond and Alan Lomax romanticized the tale in the 1960s revival, blending it with Johnson's mysterious demise. The myth's cultural impact is profound. It inspired films like Crossroads, 1986, books and songs by artists like Cream, Crossroads. Critics argue it diminishes Johnson's talent, reducing hard work to magic, while perpetuating racist stereotypes of black musicians as primitive or cursed. Despite this, the legend has cemented Johnson's iconic status, making his death a pivotal element in blues mythology. Poisoning theories dominate speculations about Johnson's death, blending fact with folklore. The primary account comes from David Honeyboy Edwards, who claimed Johnson was poisoned at a juke joint near Greenwood. Johnson, known for flirting, allegedly romanced the wife of the venue's owner or barkeeper. The jealous husband laced a bottle of whiskey with strychnine or naphthalene, mothballs, a common rural poison. Edwards said he knocked away one bottle, warning Johnson, but Johnson accepted another, falling ill shortly after. Symptoms: severe pain, vomiting, convulsions, match strychnine poisoning, which causes muscle spasms and respiratory failure. However, toxicologists note strychnine's bitter taste makes it hard to conceal in whiskey, and death usually occurs within hours, not days, as with Johnson. Naphthalene dissolved in alcohol could cause slower toxicity, leading to organ failure over days, aligning better with accounts. Other witnesses, like Sonny Boy Williamson II, corroborated the poisoning, advising Johnson not to drink from open bottles. The plantation owner where Johnson died noted syphilis on the death certificate, but oral histories suggest poisoning as the immediate cause, perhaps compounded by underlying health issues like an ulcer or varices, making him vulnerable to toxins. These theories reflect Delta social dynamics. Juke joints were sites of passion, jealousy, and violence, with alcohol fueling conflicts. Johnson's reputation as a womanizer made him a target, and poisoning was a discreet revenge method in a community where direct confrontation risked retaliation. While unproven, the consistency of accounts from Edwards and others lends credibility, making poisoning the most accepted non-mythic explanation. The Crossroads legend is central to myths about Johnson's death, originating from Delta folklore, where crossroads symbolize decision points, influenced by African diasporic traditions of Legba, the Yoruba gatekeeper god. In Hoodoo, meeting a black man, Legba, at midnight for skill acquisition was common, but Johnson's story Christianized it into a devil pact. Sunhouse recounted Johnson's initial ineptitude, followed by a disappearance and return with virtuoso skills, joking about a devil deal. This tale, spread by peers, linked to his death. At 27, the devil claimed his soul. Songs like Me and the Devil Blues, 1937, where the devil knocks at his door, reinforce this. Though lyrics may metaphorically address personal demons, the legend influenced perceptions of his death, framing poisoning or illness as supernatural retribution. Post-1960s revivalists like Hammond amplified it, romanticizing Johnson as a cursed genius. Critics like Elijah Wald argue it's a misinterpretation of hoodoo, reducing African American culture to exoticism. The myth's endurance has inspired art, from Led Zeppelin's covers to the film Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, 2000, but it overshadows Johnson's technical innovations, like bottleneck slide and rhythmic complexity. The 27 Club refers to a list of influential artists, primarily musicians, who died at age 27, often from drug abuse, suicide, accidents, or homicide. Its origins traced to the late 1960s and early 1970s, with the deaths of Brian Jones, 1969, Jimi Hendrix, 1970, Janis Joplin, 1970, and Jim Morrison, 1971, all at 27. Media noted the coincidence, but the term 27 Club gained traction after Kurt Cobain's 1994 suicide, when his mother reportedly said he joined That Stupid Club, referencing the earlier rock deaths. The concept expanded retroactively, including Robert Johnson, 1938, as an early member. Johnson's inclusion stems from his mythic status, with his death at 27 fitting the pattern of tragic talent lost young. Other early figures include Alexandra Levy, 1892, and Rudy Lewis, 1964, but the club's cultural prominence grew in the rock era. Statistically, studies like a 2011 British Medical Journal analysis found no increased death risk at 27 for musicians, with higher mortality in young adulthood generally. A 2014 study suggested age 56 as more common for musician deaths. Critics view it as confirmation bias, where notable deaths at 27 are highlighted, ignoring others. Culturally, the 27 Club embodies the live fast, die young rock ethos, romanticizing self-destruction. It appears in media from songs like Magenta's I'm Alive to films like The 27 Club, 2008. While intriguing, it oversimplifies complex lives, reducing artists to their demise rather than achievements. Robert Johnson is often cited as the inaugural member of the 27 Club, his 1938 death at 27 predating the rock era. His inclusion retroactively anchors the club in blues history, linking modern rock to its roots. Johnson's legend, the Crossroads deal, haunting lyrics and sudden death, embodies the club's tragic allure, with his age amplifying the supernatural narrative. The ultimate irony is that Johnson's big break came just after he died. The legendary record producer John Hammond was organizing a landmark concert at Carnegie Hall in New York called From Spirituals to Swing, designed to showcase the history of African American music. Hammond considered Robert Johnson the greatest country blues artist he had ever heard, and he sent scouts down to Mississippi to find him. They arrived just weeks too late. Hammond received the news of Johnson's death with deep regret. At the concert, he left an empty chair on the stage for the man who couldn't be there. He then played two of Johnson's records, Walkin' Blues and Preachin' Blues, for the stunned and captivated Carnegie Hall audience. The ghost of Robert Johnson had finally made it to the big time. The true significance of Robert Johnson's story lies not in the mysteries of his life, but in the immense power of his music. For nearly 25 years after his death, he remained a cult figure, known only to die-hard blues aficionados. That all changed in 1961, when Columbia Records released a compilation album titled King of the Delta Blues Singers. This single LP, containing 16 of his 29 songs, landed like a lightning bolt in the hands of a new generation of young musicians in Britain and America who were hungry for something authentic and real. A young Eric Clapton, then a teenager, was obsessed with the album. He would listen to the songs over and over, trying to decipher the complex guitar work. He famously called Johnson the most important blues singer that ever lived. In London, a young Keith Richards was introduced to Johnson's music by his bandmate Brian Jones. Richards was so blown away by the intricate guitar playing that he initially thought it had to be two people playing at once. The Rolling Stones would go on to cover Johnson's Love in Vain and Stop Breaking Down Blues, introducing his music to millions. Bob Dylan was another disciple. On the cover of his groundbreaking 1965 album Bringing It All Back Home, you can see a copy of Johnson's King of the Delta Blues Singers sitting prominently in the background, a clear nod to his influence. From Led Zeppelin's reworked version of Traveling Riverside Blues to the blues rock of Cream and Fleetwood Mac, Johnson's musical DNA is everywhere. He provided the blueprint, the vocabulary, and the emotional intensity that would form the very bedrock of rock and roll. In 1986, He was rightfully inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as one of its very first early influences. His legacy is the musical language that has dominated popular culture for over half a century. As a founding figure, Johnson influenced later members. Hendrix and Morrison cited his work, with Hendrix covering Red House, inspired by Johnson. Cobain and Winehouse drew from blues traditions Johnson pioneered. His death's myths, Poison, Devil's Due, parallel club members' demises. Jones drowned under suspicious circumstances. Hendrix asphyxiated on vomit. Joplin overdosed on heroin. Morrison died of heart failure amid drug rumors. Cobain committed suicide. Johnson's role has been popularized in lists by Rolling Stone and Britannica, positioning him as the club's patriarch. This connection enhances his legacy, introducing his music to new generations through club lore, though it sometimes overshadows his innovations, like complex finger-picking and emotional depth. Johnson's death has profoundly shaped his cultural impact, transforming him from obscure bluesman to mythic icon. His 29 recordings, with their themes of hellhounds and damnation, gained legendary status post-death, rediscovered in the 1960s by collectors like Hammond. The 1961 compilation King of the Delta Blues Singers introduced him to white audiences, influencing the British blues revival and rock acts like the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin. The mystery of his death fueled biographies, documentaries, and fiction, from Greil Marcus's Mystery Train, 1975, to films like Crossroads, 1886. His grave sites, 3 markers in Mississippi, draw pilgrims, symbolizing the enigma. The 27 Club connection has amplified this, with Johnson as its blues progenitor, linking him to modern tragedies. Yet his musical legacy endures independently. Johnson's techniques, slide guitar, walking bass lines inspired generations, from Muddy Waters to Clapton, who called him the most important blues musician who ever lived. His songs, covered by countless artists, remain standards, preserving his voice amid the myths. In the end, we are left with more questions than answers. Who was Robert Johnson? Was he a cursed soul who made a pact with the devil, or a grieving young man who poured his immense personal tragedy into his music? Was he a victim of a jealous husband's poison, or simply another casualty of a hard and unforgiving life? The truth is, we will likely never know for sure. The shadows that obscured his life have grown only longer with time. But perhaps the mystery is part of the point. Robert Johnson has become more than a man. He is an idea. He represents the primal power of the blues, the place where sorrow and art intersect. He is the ghost at the crossroads of American music, the point where the rural acoustic past met the electric amplified future. His life was short, tragic, and shrouded in darkness, but the 29 songs he left behind are immortal. They are a testament to the enduring power of a single voice and a guitar to capture the deepest truth of the human experience. He was a man who sang as if a hellhound was on his trail, and in doing so, he led generations of musicians toward a new kind of musical salvation. And that wraps up today's video. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like, leave a comment with your feedback, and subscribe to stay updated on upcoming videos. Appreciate you watching.